I found out that my parents secretly had a college fund for me. They spent it on my brother's third wedding. I worked 3 jobs through college. Every morning I'd open the coffee shop at 5 a.m., go to classes, then wait tables until midnight. Weekends I stocked shelves at the grocery store. My parents always said they wished they could help, but money was tight. They'd watch me eat rice and beans for the 5th day straight and say they were proud of how independent I was. My older brother Keith never went to college. He got married at 20 to his high school girlfriend, divorced at 22, married again at 24, divorced at 27, then got engaged again at 29. My parents paid for all of it. They said Keith needed more support because he didn't have a degree like I was getting. Made sense at the time. I graduated with $30,000 in loans, but I had my degree. Got a decent job at an accounting firm, started paying everything down, moved into my own place. Life was tight, but I was managing. Then my dad had a minor heart issue and needed someone to handle their finances while he recovered. That's when I found it. A statement from an old investment account with my name on it. The account was opened when I was born. Grandma had put in $10,000. My parents had added to it every year. By the time I turned 18, there was $42,000 in that account. It was emptied 3 months before I started college. The withdrawal date matched exactly with Keith's second wedding. I drove to their house immediately. My mom was in the kitchen making Keith's favorite lasagna because he was coming over with his new fiancée to discuss wedding number 3. I put the statement on the counter. Mom looked at it and said it wasn't what it looked like. I asked what it looked like then. She said that money was family money and Keith needed it more. Dad came in and backed her up. They said I was doing fine on my own and Keith struggled with relationships, so he needed their financial support. I asked if they thought about telling me while I was working 60 hours a week to pay for textbooks. Mom said I was being selfish. Keith showed up with his fiancée Ashley right then. She was already talking about their destination wedding plans. Keith saw the statement and immediately said that money was promised to him anyway because he was the oldest. Ashley started talking about how unfair it was that I was trying to take money from their special day. I hadn't even mentioned the current wedding yet. That's when Dad let it slip that they were planning to give Keith another $15,000 for this wedding, from their retirement account this time. I left without saying anything else. But I wasn't done. See, Keith owned a small construction business. He always bragged about how successful he was. What he didn't mention was that Dad co-signed all his business loans, and Mom did his books for free. I knew this because Mom would complain about doing his paperwork while I was studying for my CPA exam. First thing I did was stop doing their taxes. I'd been doing them for free since I graduated. When Mom called asking about it, I said I was too busy. She said I owed them for raising me. I said they owed me $42,000 for my education. She hung up. Then I started charging Keith market rate for any accounting advice. He called me screaming when he got my invoice for reviewing his quarterly reports. I told him successful businessmen pay for professional services. He said I was tearing the family apart. Next, I made sure I was conveniently unavailable every time they needed something. Dad needed a ride to his cardiology appointment during my work hours. Sorry, can't leave the office. Mom needed help setting up online banking. Maybe Keith can help since he got my college fund. The best part was Thanksgiving. They always hosted and I always brought 3 dishes plus dessert. This year I showed up with a store-bought pie. Mom was frantically cooking because she expected me to handle sides like always. Keith and Ashley were sitting in the living room while his 2 ex-wives were also there to drop off his kids. It was chaos. I stood there watching Mom rush around the kitchen while Keith and Ashley sat on the couch like they were waiting to be served. The 2 ex-wives were in the hallway arguing about pickup times while Keith's kids ran around screaming. This was every holiday for the past 10 years. Mom stressed and cooking everything herself, while Keith showed up empty-handed expecting to be taken care of. Dad would sit in his chair pretending not to notice the chaos. And me, I was supposed to fix it all by bringing half the meal and keeping everyone calm and making sure nobody fought too much. I walked past the living room where Keith had his arm around Ashley showing her something on his phone. Neither of them looked up. I grabbed my keys from the hook by the door and left. Nobody even noticed me go until my car was already backing out of the driveway. The drive home took 20 minutes, and my phone started going off before I hit the highway. Mom's name flashed on the screen 3 times before I put the phone in my cup holder and ignored it. By the time I got to my apartment building, there were 12 texts and 4 missed calls. I sat in my parking spot and read through them. Mom said I was being incredibly rude and everyone was waiting for me to come back. Dad said I was making a scene over something that happened years ago and I needed to let it go. Keith sent one that just said, "Really, bro?" Like I was the problem. Ashley sent one asking if I was okay, but I knew Keith told her to send it. I turned my phone on silent and went inside. My apartment was quiet and empty and exactly what I needed. I made myself a sandwich and ate it standing at the counter. The phone kept lighting up with more texts, but I didn't look at them. I turned on the TV and found a football game and sat there not really watching it. Around 8 o'clock, Mom called again, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She was crying and saying I ruined Thanksgiving and how could I just leave like that. I asked her how she could steal my college fund, and she went quiet. Then she said we already talked about this, and I needed to move on. I hung up. I couldn't sleep that night, so I got up around 6 and made coffee. I kept thinking about that account statement and the dates and the money. $42,000 that was supposed to be mine. I thought about calling someone, but it was Thanksgiving morning, and most people were probably still asleep or dealing with their own family stuff. Then I remembered Cam mentioning he usually went to his sister's place for coffee on holiday mornings because his family drove him crazy too. I texted him asking if he was free, and he replied right away saying yes. We met at the coffee shop near my office an hour later. Cam was already there with 2 cups waiting when I walked in. I sat down and told him everything. The whole story from finding the account statement to the scene at Thanksgiving dinner. He listened without interrupting, and his face got more angry as I talked. When I finished, he was quiet for a minute. Then he said what my parents did wasn't just unfair, it was financial abuse. He said they stole from me and then made me feel guilty for being upset about it. He said I needed to protect myself because people who do something like that once will do it again. I hadn't thought about it that way, but he was right. I spent the rest of the weekend going through every financial record I had that involved my parents or Keith. I made a spreadsheet with dates and amounts and descriptions. The tax returns I did for free every year since I graduated. The quarterly reports I reviewed for Keith's business. The financial advice I gave Mom about their retirement accounts. I added it all up, and it came to thousands of dollars in services. Then I found the loans I gave Keith. $3,000 when his first business partner quit. $2,000 for his second divorce lawyer. Another $3,000 for a down payment on his truck. He said Mom and Dad would pay me back, but they never did. The total was $8,000 that I never expected to see again. Monday morning, I went into work early and asked to speak with Amy. She was my boss and handled all the personnel stuff for our department. I told her I needed to officially recuse myself from giving any personal financial advice to family members due to a conflict of interest. She asked if everything was okay, and I gave her the short version about the college fund and Keith's business. She nodded and said it was actually more professional to maintain those boundaries anyway. She made a note in my file and said if anyone from my family contacted the office, she would redirect them. I felt relieved having it official. Tuesday night, I was heating up leftover pasta when someone started pounding on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw Keith standing there looking angry. He pounded again and yelled, asking why I was punishing the whole family over money. I stayed by the door and told him through it that he got my college fund, so he could figure out his own accounting from now on. He kept pounding and saying I needed to open the door so we could talk like adults. I said adults don't steal from their siblings, and I was done talking. He started yelling that I was jealous of his success, and always had been. He said Mom and Dad helped him because he needed it more than I did. He said I had a fancy degree and a good job, so I didn't understand what it was like to struggle. I opened the door then and looked at him. I asked him to explain how a destination wedding to his third wife counted as struggling and needing help. His face went red, and he started stammering about how Ashley was the one, and this wedding was important. Keith actually tried to tell me that his wedding expenses were business investments. He said he networked at wedding events and met potential clients. He said the destination wedding would be full of people with money who might need construction work. I laughed right in his face and told him that if his business was actually successful, he wouldn't need Dad to co-sign all his loans. He went quiet and stared at me. Then he said I was going to regret this, and he would make sure the whole family knew what I was doing. He said I was tearing everyone apart over money that wasn't even mine to begin with. I told him the account had my name on it, and Grandma opened it for me, not him. He turned and walked away, saying I would be sorry. I closed the door and locked it, and realized I didn't actually care if he turned the family against me. The family that stole $42,000 from me and then expected me to be grateful for learning independence wasn't a family I needed to protect. I made myself dinner and watched TV and slept better than I had in days. Mom called the next afternoon while I was at work. I stepped outside to take it, and she was crying before I even said hello. She said I was tearing the family apart, and Keith was devastated by what I said to him. She said Dad's blood pressure was up from all the stress, and it wasn't good for his heart. She said Ashley was having second thoughts about the wedding because of the fighting. I waited until she stopped talking, and then I asked her point blank if she ever planned to tell me about the college fund. I asked if she hoped I would never find out. She didn't answer right away, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. She went quiet, and I could tell she was trying to figure out what to say. Finally, she told me they were going to pay me back when things got better. I asked her when exactly things were supposed to get better, considering they were planning to give Keith another $15,000 from their retirement account for wedding number 3. She started making excuses about how Keith had a harder life because his marriages failed and he had kids to support now. I reminded her that his marriages failed because he was bad with money and couldn't keep a job for more than a year without Dad bailing out his business. I told her I had to support myself through college because they stole from me. She started crying harder and said I was being cruel. Dad grabbed the phone from her and told me to apologize to my mother right now. He said I was being selfish and ungrateful after everything they did for me. I told him I found out about the college fund while doing them a favor and managing their finances during his heart scare. I said the only selfish people in this situation were the ones who took $42,000 that Grandma left for me and spent it on Keith's second wedding. He started yelling that I had no right to judge their decisions, and they were my parents. I hung up on him. My hands were shaking, but I felt good about it. I opened my laptop and started going through my files. I pulled up every receipt I had saved from helping them over the years. The tax returns I did for free, the financial planning sessions, the times I co-signed for their car loan when their credit was bad. I found the emails where Keith asked me for money, and I transferred it to him. $3,000 when his first business partner quit, and he needed to cover payroll. $2,000 for his second divorce lawyer. Another $3,000 for a down payment on his truck, because the dealership wouldn't finance him. Every time he said Mom and Dad would pay me back, they never did. I made a spreadsheet with dates and amounts. The total was over $8,000 in direct loans, plus probably another $5,000 in free services. I saved everything to a folder and backed it up on a flash drive. Cam had told me I might need evidence if this got worse, and my family's pattern said it would get worse. 2 days later, my phone rang with Keith's number, but it was Ashley's voice. She said Keith was really hurt by everything that happened, and they wanted to smooth things over. She said they were even willing to postpone the wedding if it would help keep the peace in the family. That told me everything I needed to know. They were worried about losing that $15,000 from my parents. I told Ashley this wasn't about their wedding. I said it was about my parents stealing my education fund and then expecting me to keep paying for Keith's life forever. She got quiet for a minute and then said she didn't know about the college fund. I asked her what Keith told her about why neither of us went to college. She said Keith told her our parents couldn't afford to help with college for either of them, and that's why he went straight to work instead. I realized right then that Keith had been lying to everyone about the family money to hide how much our parents favored him. Ashley said she was starting to notice some things about how Keith handled money, and she wanted to understand the full picture. She asked if I could send her proof of what I was talking about. I opened my email and attached the college fund statement showing the $42,000 and the withdrawal date. Then I attached copies of the loan requests from Keith, where he said our parents would pay me back. I sent it all to her email address. She thanked me and said she needed to think about some things. The next morning, Keith called me screaming. He said I was trying to ruin his relationship, and Ashley was asking all kinds of questions about money he borrowed. He said she wanted to know about other loans and debts he never told her about. I said that was between the two of them and hung up. I felt lighter than I had in weeks. My phone kept buzzing with texts from him, but I didn't read them. I went to work and actually focused on my job for the first time since Thanksgiving. That afternoon, I got a LinkedIn message from Stuart Harding. He said he was Keith's business partner, and he needed to talk to me confidentially. He said he was concerned about some things in the business finances, and he knew I was an accountant who used to help Keith with his books. He asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss it. I stared at the message for a long time. This was about to get a lot more complicated. I met Stuart at a coffee shop near his office the next afternoon. He showed up with a folder full of papers and the kind of tired look that said he hadn't slept much. We got our drinks and sat at a corner table away from everyone else. He opened the folder and spread out several pages of expense reports and bank statements. His finger pointed to a line item for $5,000 labeled as office equipment, then another for $3,000 marked as client entertainment, then a $2,000 charge for marketing materials. He looked at me and asked if Keith normally mixed personal spending with business expenses, or if this was something new. I looked at the dates on the statements. The $5,000 charge happened the same week Keith and Ashley went to look at wedding venues in Mexico. The $3,000 matched up with their engagement party. The marketing materials charge was the exact amount Ashley posted on social media about her wedding dress shopping trip. I told Stuart this wasn't new behavior. Keith had always been bad with money and our parents had always fixed his problems. Stuart's face went pale. He said he'd been covering for Keith's mistakes for 2 years because he thought it was just Keith being disorganized with paperwork. He said he'd redone invoices, cleaned up billing errors, even paid for things out of his own pocket when Keith forgot to submit receipts. I asked how much he'd personally covered. Stuart did some math on his phone and said probably close to $10,000 over 2 years. I showed him the pattern I'd noticed in the dates. Every major charge that looked suspicious lined up with something Keith was doing for his personal life. Stuart started going through more statements and found a $4,000 charge from 6 months ago that matched Keith's anniversary trip with Ashley. Another $3,000 from a year ago that was right after Keith bought his truck. Stuart pushed the papers away and put his head in his hands. He asked if I would be willing to do a formal audit of the business books as a paid consultant. He said he needed to know exactly how bad this was before he decided whether to force Keith to buy him out or just dissolve the whole partnership. I agreed to do it. Stuart gave me access to all the business accounts and records. I spent the next week going through everything while still working my regular job. I'd come home every night and pull up Keith's files on my laptop. The more I dug into it, the worse it got. Personal expenses were mixed in with legitimate business costs everywhere. Restaurant charges that Keith claimed were client meetings, but happened on weekends when the business was closed. Hotel stays that were marked as work travel, but matched up with Keith's vacation posts on social media. Equipment purchases that never showed up in the business inventory. There were missing receipts for thousands of dollars in cash withdrawals. Tax deductions that looked questionable at best and fraudulent at worst. The biggest problem was the loans Dad had co-signed. Keith had told the bank the money was for equipment and expansion. The loan applications showed projected revenue that the business never came close to hitting. I could prove that at least $15,000 from those loans went to personal expenses instead of business ones. If the bank found out, they could call the loans immediately and possibly press charges for fraud. I added up all the personal expenses Keith had charged to the business incorrectly. The total came to $35,000. That didn't count the money Stuart had already covered or the potential tax penalties if the IRS audited them. I wrote everything up in a detailed report for Stuart. I included copies of every questionable transaction with notes about what Keith was actually doing on those dates. I added recommendations for how to fix the problems if Stuart wanted to try saving the business. I also included a section about what would happen if the bank or IRS found out about the irregularities before they were corrected. Stuart called me the day after I sent him the report. He sounded furious. He said this could sink the whole company and take his personal finances with it. He said he'd trusted Keith as a partner, and Keith had been stealing from him for years. I asked what he was going to do. Stuart said he was going to force Keith to buy him out of the partnership, or he'd report everything to the bank. That would trigger the loans being called and probably start a fraud investigation. Either way, Stuart was done being Keith's safety net. 2 days later, Keith showed up at my office building. I was in the lobby getting coffee from the machine when I heard him screaming my name. He was red in the face and shaking. He yelled that I had betrayed him and destroyed his business. He said I'd always been jealous of his success, and now I'd finally found a way to ruin him. Security started moving toward us. My co-workers were staring. Keith kept yelling that I'd sabotaged him by lying to Stuart about the books. I stayed calm and told him I didn't lie about anything. I said I did a legitimate audit that showed he'd been committing fraud. Security reached Keith and told him he needed to leave. He tried to push past them to get to me. They grabbed his arms and started walking him toward the door. He screamed over his shoulder that this wasn't over and I'd be sorry. They got him outside, and I could see through the glass doors that they were telling him not to come back. My boss, Amy, came down from her office. She'd heard the commotion and wanted to know what happened. I explained the whole situation in her office. The college fund, the family dynamics, Stuart hiring me to audit Keith's business, and what I'd found. Amy listened to everything and then said, Family financial disputes were always messy, but I'd handled it professionally. I'd done a legitimate audit as a paid consultant. The findings were what they were. She said I should document everything in case Keith tried to claim I'd sabotaged him somehow. She suggested I keep copies of all my communications with Stuart and my audit report. That night, Mom called. She was crying before I even said hello. She said Keith was talking about suing me for ruining his business. She said Ashley had called off the wedding after finding out about all the money problems. She said Keith was devastated, and it was all my fault. I told her Keith ruined his own business by committing fraud. I said Ashley made a smart choice because Keith had been lying to her about money the whole time they were together. Mom started begging me to fix this somehow. She said I needed to talk to Stuart and make this go away. She said Keith was family, and I should be helping him instead of destroying him. I asked her why I should clean up Keith's mess when nobody helped me with $30,000 in student loans after they stole my college fund. Mom went quiet, and I could hear Dad's voice in the background getting louder. She said something away from the phone, and then Dad was there. He said I needed to stop this nonsense right now and help my brother like family is supposed to do. I asked him what part of stealing my college fund counted as family helping me. He ignored that completely and said if I didn't help Keith fix this mess with Stuart, then I was out of the will. I actually laughed out loud at that. I told him the will probably left everything to Keith anyway, so he wasn't threatening me with anything I expected to get. He started yelling that I was being cruel and Keith was going through a hard time. I said Keith had been going through a hard time for 15 years and they'd enabled every second of it. Dad said I was ungrateful after everything they'd done for me. I reminded him they hadn't done anything for me except watch me work 3 jobs while they spent my education money on Keith's weddings. He hung up on me. I called back immediately. Mom answered and I could tell she'd been crying. I said I needed them both to hear this, so she should put me on speaker. She did, and I heard Dad breathing hard in the background. I told them both that I was done being the responsible son who gets nothing, while Keith gets everything and makes nothing of it. I said they could keep enabling his dysfunction, but they'd be doing it without my help from now on. Mom started crying harder and saying I was tearing the family apart. I said they tore it apart when they stole from me and lied about it for years. I hung up and blocked both their numbers for a few days because I needed space to think without the guilt trips. 3 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Ashley, and she sounded different from the last time we'd talked. She said she needed to thank me for sending her those financial documents about Keith. I asked if Keith knew she was calling me. She said no, and she didn't care because she'd called off the wedding that morning. She said after seeing the college fund statement and the loan records I sent her, she started asking Keith direct questions about money. He'd lied about everything. He told her his parents were poor and couldn't help either of their kids with college. He said the money for his previous weddings came from his business profits. He claimed he'd paid back every loan his parents gave him. Ashley said she went through their joint bank account after our conversation and found he'd been hiding purchases from her for months. She'd thought they were saving for the wedding, but he'd spent almost $6,000 on things he told her he wasn't buying. She thanked me because she said if she'd married him, she would have been stuck with his financial mess and his lies. I told her I was sorry she had to find out that way, but I was glad she found out before the wedding. She said she wasn't sorry at all because now she knew who Keith really was. Then Ashley said something that surprised me. She told me that after she called off the wedding, Keith's first 2 ex-wives had both reached out to her. They'd seen on social media that the engagement was off, and they wanted to share their stories. Both of them told Ashley almost identical things about Keith's financial irresponsibility and how our parents always bailed him out. His first wife said she left him after finding out he'd taken out credit cards in her name without telling her. His second wife said our parents paid their rent for 8 months straight because Keith kept spending his paychecks on tools for the business that he never actually needed. Ashley said there was apparently a pattern going back 15 years of Keith making terrible money choices and our parents fixing everything for him. She said all 3 of them were planning to meet up for coffee because they wanted to compare notes about what they'd been through. I didn't know what to say to that. Ashley thanked me again and hung up. I sat there thinking about how my parents had destroyed not just my relationship with Keith, but Keith's ability to function as an adult. They'd ruined his marriages by teaching him he never had to face consequences. The next week, Stuart called me. He said he'd given Keith 30 days to either buy him out of the business or pay back the $35,000 in personal expenses plus interest. Keith couldn't do either one. Stuart said he was officially dissolving the partnership, and Keith would have to figure out what to do with his half of the business on his own. Stuart had already filed the paperwork and notified the bank about the partnership ending. He said he was starting his own construction company without Keith, and he wanted to know if I'd be interested in doing their books. I said yes immediately. Stuart was a good guy who'd been dragged down by my brother's mess, and I wanted to help him succeed. He said he'd send over the contract and we could start fresh. I felt good about that conversation. At least something positive was coming out of this disaster. 2 days after that, I got a call from my dad's cell phone. I'd unblocked them because I figured enough time had passed. But it wasn't Dad calling. It was a loan officer from their bank. She said she was trying to reach my father about the co-signed loans for Keith's business. I told her I wasn't my father, and she'd called his number. She apologized and said she'd been trying to reach him for 3 days with no answer. She asked if I knew how to contact him about an urgent matter regarding the loans. I asked what was going on. She said that during their review of Keith's business dissolution, they'd found irregularities in how the loan money had been used. The loans were being called in immediately, and my father, as the co-signer, was responsible for the full $40,000. I felt my stomach drop. I asked when they needed the money. She said they'd already sent multiple notices, and if they didn't receive payment within 10 days, they'd begin collection proceedings. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called my parents' house from my work phone so they wouldn't see my number. Mom answered on the first ring. She was crying before she even said hello. She said they'd been trying to reach me for days, but I wasn't answering. I told her I'd blocked them temporarily and asked what was going on. She said the bank was demanding $40,000 for Keith's loans, and they didn't have it. She said they'd taken money from their savings to help Keith try to avoid bankruptcy, but now they had nothing left, and the bank wanted the full amount. She begged me to help them negotiate with the bank because they were going to lose the house. I sat there listening to her cry and feeling absolutely nothing. I told her I'd help them as their accountant for my standard hourly rate, same as any other client. She stopped crying immediately. She said she couldn't believe I'd charge my own parents during a crisis. I reminded her that I'd been doing their taxes for free for years while they spent my college fund on Keith. I said professional services cost money, and I was a professional. She started crying again and said I was being cruel when they needed help. I told her my rate was $150 an hour, and if she wanted my help, she could hire me like any other client. She hung up on me. I figured that was the end of it, but then Dad called me an hour later. He said they weren't paying me anything, and he'd handle the bank himself. I told him that was his choice, but he should probably talk to someone who knows what they're doing. He said he'd managed money his whole life, and he didn't need advice from his ungrateful son. I said good luck and hung up. Over the next week, I heard nothing from them. Then Stuart called and said Keith had filed for bankruptcy. He said the business assets were being liquidated, and Keith was moving back in with our parents because he couldn't afford his apartment anymore. I asked how Stuart's new company was going. He said great, and he'd already landed 2 big contracts. He thanked me again for the audit because it saved him from going down with Keith's sinking ship. I told him I was glad I could help. That same day, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was the loan officer from the bank again. She said my father had come in to negotiate the loans, but he'd missed 2 payments while trying to work something out. The bank was starting foreclosure proceedings on the house. She said she was calling me because my father had listed me as a reference on the original loan documents years ago. She wanted to know if I had any way to contact him about setting up a payment plan before the foreclosure went through. I asked how much time they had. She said 30 days before the bank took possession of the house. I hung up and sat at my desk, staring at nothing. I didn't want my parents homeless even though they'd stolen from me and enabled Keith's dysfunction for years. They were still my parents, and the thought of them losing everything made me feel sick. I called Mom's cell. She answered, and I could hear how tired she was. I asked if Dad was there. She said yes and put me on speaker. I told them I'd help them one more time for free, but this was the last time. I said I'd negotiate with the bank and get them a payment plan, but they needed to understand this was it. No more free help after this. Mom started thanking me, but I cut her off. I said I needed all their financial documents and access to their accounts by tomorrow morning. Dad tried to argue, but I told him he could either let me help or lose the house. He agreed. I spent the next 3 days going through everything and building a case for the bank. Their credit was shot from missed payments and the loan defaults. Their savings was gone. They had equity in the house, but not enough to pay off the loans completely. I put together a proposal for a 5-year payment plan that would let them keep the house, but would take every extra dollar they had. I met with the loan officer and their manager. I showed them the payment plan and explained that foreclosure would cost the bank more in legal fees than they'd get from the sale. It took 2 meetings, but they agreed. My parents would be paying $800 a month for the next 5 years, but they'd keep their house. I told them I'd draw up the agreement that week. Mom kept trying to negotiate, saying they'd never give Keith money again without checking with me first, but I said no, written agreement, or I walk away and they lose the house. Dad finally told her to stop arguing and just sign whatever I put in front of them. I drafted a simple contract that said they couldn't give Keith any financial support over $500 without my written approval, and their will would split everything 50-50 between us. I made 3 copies and brought them over on Saturday morning. Keith wasn't there, which was good, because I didn't want to deal with him. Mom read through it twice with tears running down her face. She kept saying this wasn't how families were supposed to work. I reminded her that stealing my college fund wasn't how families were supposed to work either. Dad signed first without saying anything. Mom held the pen for a long time before she finally signed too. I took all 3 copies, got them notarized at the bank on Monday, and sent them each a copy by certified mail. The original went in my safe deposit box. Keith filed for bankruptcy 2 weeks later. The construction business was completely gone, and he owed money to suppliers, contractors, and the IRS. He moved back into my parents' house because he couldn't afford rent anywhere. Mom called to tell me, probably hoping I'd feel bad about it. I told her that was fine, but I wouldn't be coming over while he was living there. She asked how long I planned to avoid my own family. I said as long as it takes for Keith to find his own place, and they needed to give him a deadline instead of letting him camp out indefinitely. Dad got on the phone and said they'd tell Keith he had 6 months to get back on his feet. I said 3 months maximum, or I'd assume they were enabling him again. Dad agreed to 3 months. I didn't hear much from any of them after that. Mom would send occasional texts about family stuff that I mostly ignored. Dad called once to tell me Keith was looking for work, but it was hard with the bankruptcy on his record. I didn't respond to that one at all. Then one day Stuart called and said he was hiring Keith as a regular construction worker. I asked if he was serious. Stuart said Keith actually knew the trade pretty well when he wasn't trying to run a business or manage money. He said Keith needed structure and supervision, and Stuart's new company could provide that. He promised to keep an eye on Keith's work and not give him any financial responsibilities. I thanked Stuart for letting me know and told him I appreciated him giving Keith a chance even after everything that happened. Stuart said everyone deserves a chance to earn an honest living, even if they're terrible at being their own boss. Around that same time, Mom called with gossip she thought I'd find interesting. Ashley had started dating someone new. It turned out to be one of Keith's ex-wife's brothers, which Mom said was causing all kinds of drama. Keith was apparently very upset about it and kept complaining to Mom about how inappropriate it was. I told Mom that Ashley dodged a bullet by not marrying Keith, and Keith was lucky anyone in that family still spoke to him after he dragged them through 2 divorces. Mom got quiet and then said, maybe I was right about that. It was the first time she'd admitted Keith might be the problem in his relationships. I'd been working late a lot at the office, mostly because I didn't have much else going on. Cam noticed and started inviting me to after-work events. One of them was a networking thing where I met his sister Kathy. She worked in HR at a different firm, and we ended up talking for 2 hours about work stuff and life stuff. I mentioned my family situation in general terms, and she said it sounded like I'd handled a difficult situation with a lot more grace than it probably deserved. That felt validating coming from someone who didn't know my parents or Keith. We started getting coffee sometimes, then dinner, and eventually I admitted to Cam that I was dating his sister. He laughed and said he'd figured that out weeks ago and was wondering when I'd mention it. Kathy knew the whole story by then, and her take on it was that my parents had committed financial abuse, not just favoritism. Hearing someone else say that made me feel less crazy about the whole thing. Dad called me out of nowhere one afternoon and asked if we could meet for coffee. I almost said no, but something in his voice made me agree. We met at a place near my office, and he looked older than I remembered. He ordered coffee and didn't touch it. Then he said he wanted to apologize. He said he'd thought helping Keith more was the right thing because Keith struggled with life, and I seemed to have everything together. But he could see now that all they did was make Keith helpless and take advantage of me. He said it stiffly, like the words didn't come naturally, but I could tell he meant it. I asked if Mom felt the same way. He said she was getting there, but it was harder for her to admit she'd been wrong. I told him I appreciated the apology, and I hoped they'd stick to the agreement we'd signed. He promised they would. Mom took another few months. She'd call sometimes, and we'd have awkward conversations where she tried to act like everything was normal. I kept my answers short until one day she finally broke down and said she needed to tell me something. She admitted she'd enabled Keith for years because she felt guilty about his divorces and wanted to fix his life for him. She thought if she just helped him enough, he'd eventually get stable and happy. I told her you can't fix someone's life by stealing from another child. She cried and said she knew that now, that she'd been so focused on Keith's problems that she'd ignored how much damage she was doing to both of us. She said she understood if I never forgave her, but she wanted me to know she was sorry. I told her I wasn't ready to say everything was fine, but I appreciated her finally being honest about it. Keith moved out of their house right at the 3-month deadline. He found a tiny apartment he could afford on his construction wages. Mom told me it wasn't in a great area, and he didn't have much furniture, but he was paying his own rent for the first time in years. She said it like she expected me to feel sorry for him. I reminded her that I'd lived in worse places while working 3 jobs to pay for college. She didn't argue with that. Keith was still bad with money, according to Stuart, but at least he was earning his own living and not dragging anyone else down with him. Stuart said Keith would probably never be great at managing finances, but he was a decent worker when someone else handled the business side. Stuart's company landed several big contracts, and I was proud to be their accountant. He paid me fairly for my work and respected my expertise instead of expecting free family favors. It was refreshing after years of my parents and Keith taking advantage of me. Stuart would sometimes mention Keith's progress at work, usually good things about his actual construction skills. I appreciated that Stuart was willing to give Keith a chance while also maintaining professional boundaries. A year after that terrible Thanksgiving where everything fell apart, I was sitting in a nice restaurant with Kathy celebrating my final student loan payment. The last $30,000 were finally gone. I'd worked 3 jobs through college, graduated with debt, and spent years paying it all off while my family spent my college fund on Keith's weddings. But I'd done it myself, and nobody could take that away from me. Kathy raised her glass and said she was proud of me. My relationship with my parents were better now that we had clear boundaries, and they understood what their favoritism had cost. Keith was finally learning to stand on his own, even if he wasn't great at it. Things weren't perfect, and probably never would be. But they were honest now, and that honesty was worth more than any college fund ever could have been.